Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. It's a real pleasure for me to be here, and I'm honored to share the stage with Alice McDermott. My job tonight is to be Charlie Rose. My job is to sit in a comfortable chair at a 45-degree angle and see if I can make you aware of what makes Alice McDermott tick and what makes her uniquely Alice. We met 5 minutes ago. In 5 minutes, we discovered that we are both fans of literary method. We love to discuss how we dig in and actually do this. Since I'm a newspaper guy and an interlocutor and a talk show host, I love to ask questions, and I'm going to ask a lot of them. But this is Alice's evening, and it's your evening. And we're going to spend about 45 minutes doing what we do, and then you will get at least 15 minutes, more if you need it, to ask your questions. In this basket here are questions which we're going to take in writing, and I will be Charlie, and I will dive and come up with a fabulous question. I haven't read them. Deliberately, I have not read them ahead of time, so if you want to influence my thinking, be the last one and put it on top. Let's begin by discussing Alice McDermott's background. She's a New York person. And Alice, I have to put my credentials on the table. I survived the Bronx. You seem to have survived Brooklyn. Is there a New York thread in your work that you seek deliberately, or is this something that so informs who you are that it comes up over and over?
Wow, well, thank you, Bob. Thank you for being Charlie Rose.
No North Carolina accent.
Right.
Sorry.
And thank you all for being here. New York, as a fiction writer, I always, I think at heart, believe that my autobiography has nothing to do with the worlds I create. Why would I write about myself? I'm much more interested in writing about this artificial world that comes to being within the pages of a book. It's part of a work of literary construction. But of course, I do have a biography, and I did grow up in New York. And I've used it for the setting of most everything that I've written in one way or the other. My second novel, That Night, didn't take place in New York, as far as I could tell. It took place in a suburb outside a city, in a bedroom community, in a post-World War II community. That was sort of what the point I was making, that it wasn't a specific place. It was a place of yearning. It was a place where men returning from the war, who often were children of immigrants, would then go out to the green, safe, brand new developments. I never said it was Long Island, but when my editor read the manuscript and knew where I was from and wrote the description for the dust jacket, he said it took place one night on Long Island. And this was only my second novel, and I called him, I said, Jonathan, I never mentioned Long Island. He said, I know, but I figured it was Long Island. And so it became a novel about Long Island. But I even said to him at the time, if I had made it Long Island, I would have made more use of the geography. So when it came to writing a book like Charming Billy, when I claim this is Long Island, this is New York, I wanted to use the geography, not because it was my experience. Yeah, sure, it's material somewhat at hand, but this is my Long Island, this is my New York. But I wanted to use the geography to work as a metaphor. Again, that place of yearning, the immigrant experience, wherever we find ourselves, whether it's Ireland or Italy or Russia or Poland, we look around and we say, there's got to be someplace better than this. And we go to the New World, and we land in cities like Boston and New York and Philadelphia. And we do the best we can in this new world, and because we want something better for our children, the children are born, and then they in turn look around and say, this city is dirty and it's dangerous, we want something better for our children, and so they find those green leafy suburbs with little patches of grass. And the geography of this city, and then this near-in suburbs, and then Long Island in particular has its Gatsby-esque eastern Long Island out on the tip, at the end of the world, facing the ocean, where the premier people of the American dream have their cottages. And there's another place of yearning. So it's not my New York, it's my character's New York. And because these are fictional characters, it's a fictional New York.
Well said. When I read your books, I am struck by so many things that you do so artfully, but I'm particularly struck by your secondary characters. I've just finished after this a book that I enjoyed tremendously, and nobody asked me, but I think the knockout character in that book is a secondary character named Pauline.
Yes.
I can't get her out of my mind. I had her in my mind this morning when I was showering. I had her in my mind as I was tying my tie. This is literature, and I want to ask you whether you devote more of your mental energy to secondary characters than to primary. Is it even? Who's winning?
Well, I mean, it's appropriate because Pauline, as a character, is someone who will not be shaken.
Right.
If you're even a little bit nice to her, she's on you for life.
As this book demonstrates,
Right.
she is
So
on these people for life.
It's appropriate that she saw that you were a sympathetic soul, and she's going to suck you dry for all your compassion. She's that kind of character. I teach at the Sewanee Writers Conference every summer, and the interesting thing about the workshops at Sewanee is that there are always two writers sort of leading the workshop. And for years I've taught with a wonderful writer named Tony Early, who teaches full-time down in Vanderbilt. And Tony has this funny thing that he says about secondary characters, usually when we're talking about a secondary character in one of the participants' stories. And he said, you have to get out of your mind that off stage from your story or your novel, there's a little green room that is filled with secondary characters. At some point in the story, somebody goes into the green room and says, sympathetic policeman, we need a sympathetic policeman. And he comes out and he appears as a sympathetic policeman, and then he goes back to the green room. Don't treat secondary characters like that. The idea is, if you're going to bring a sympathetic policeman to life, you have to think about, how was he born? Who were his parents? Where did he grow up? Where did he learn his first language? What kind of language does he use? You're evoking a human being, and when you're evoking a human being, it's not just a little fairy dust and somebody appears. You're evoking a history. So I think always having that awareness, even when a character is a walk-on or a character is just meant to sort of get the reader from one place to the other, you're bringing someone to life. You have a certain obligation to know what that character's life is.
Alice, I want to make a confession here. I have a terrible habit. I'll confess it to everybody. When I have a 1-hour layover in an airport, I walk into one of those dreadful bookstores in the airport, and there's a rack there that says, as if I'm too dumb to figure this out on my own, #1 bestseller, #2, #3. and I spent 10 minutes reading the first page of the first 10 bestsellers. And then I run screaming down the corridor looking for my next flight because I just can't stand it. These books are so bad, they are so derivative. You can just imagine the writer sitting there and hoping and praying for a TV deal and a movie deal. The characters are not even two-dimensional. You're nothing like these writers. You're truly a writer with a capital W. How do you resist the fact that that is what is on the shelf in an airport? How do you resist the whole commercial pressure on you to be somebody else?
You know, I would never have started on this career if that's what I wanted to do. You know, I tell my young students that young writers should read everything. Read those first, number 1, number 2, and number 3 bestsellers. Just so you know what you don't want to be. It's not the same thing. You know, it's sort of like saying to an artist, you know, but those paintings of Elvis on velvet really sell. You know? And you know, any artist would say, if I wanted to paint Elvis on velvet, I would do it. Clearly, that's not what I do. And so for me, it's another animal altogether. I think that's true of all the arts. Sometimes you just want something mindless, sometimes you want to watch something stupid on TV, sometimes you just want to put something over your couch that matches the curtains, you know. But we all know when we go to a play or go into a museum or pick up what's called a literary novel that we're looking for something else entirely. And that's where my job comes in. I have to say I don't even really think that much about it.
Wow, I admire you.
Maybe
Okay.
I should.
Let's talk about method, as I threatened to do. When Ernest Hemingway was about to get fired up to write, he would take 2 blasts of very serious Scotch whiskey, and then he would sit down and write. And when Saul Bellow got fired up to write, he did it the same way every day. He would go into his study, close the door, and listen to Beethoven for 10 minutes, and then he would write for 3 straight hours while listening to Beethoven. When Alice McDermott wants to get fired up,
I go to my desk.
Cup of coffee? Glass of scotch?
Yeah, the scotch you have to hold off on. I was still a fairly new writer. I had published my first novel, and I think maybe the second had come out, or was about to come out, but I know I was expecting my second child. And I was at a writer's conference out on the West Coast, and a wonderful novelist named Diane Johnson was there. And Diane had already raised 4 kids, and we were chatting. She sort of looked at my belly, and she knew about my work, and she said, I'm going to give you the best advice anybody will ever give you to be a woman who writes and has a family. And she said, you get the kids out of the house. You get them off to school. If they're too young for school, you get a babysitter to put them in a stroller and take them for a walk. You go back to your kitchen table, you stick your arm out like this, and you knock everything off the table. And you sit yourself down and you write till the children have to come back. If it's the end of the school day and they have to come back, that's when you can pick up all the stuff you knocked off on the floor, and they can help you. But just go to it and do it. No other you don't have the luxury of any other preliminary because you've got this ticking clock when you're raising kids. And I've always thought she was absolutely right. That was the best advice anyone had ever given.
Well, are you then saying that you write for 5 or 6 hours continuously?
I sit at my desk. I stay at my desk. Sometimes I'm writing, sometimes I'm rewriting, sometimes I'm taking notes, I'm reading, I'm wishing I'd gone to law school. You know?
No.
Right. But it's be there. You be there. Some days you end up with a deficit, you threw out more than you kept. Some days all you did was rewrite what you wrote the day before and maybe changed one sentence around. Sometimes you did some research and discovered something that you think you might use, but you don't know how you're going to use it yet. Sometimes all you have are notes about but you're there. Be there. I don't think you can demand anything else. It would be nice to have something more charming, in my rituals. But I've always felt that knock everything off and sit down and look and be there, working with the words, work with the sentences. That's your job.
You will forgive me for my newspaper heritage, but the best line I've ever heard about writing was uttered by the great Red Smith, the sports columnist of the New York Herald Tribune and later the New York Times, and he said, "Writing is easy. All you do is open a vein." I've never forgotten that line. I've never opened a vein. I've just opened another cup of coffee. I find that's my substitute for Scotch whiskey.
Yeah, much smarter.
Much smarter. Is writing painful for you? Do you open a vein?
Yeah, some days. It's always a mystery to begin. Number one, what's driving you to do this is a mystery. When other people have jobs that if they screw up on their job, no one's going to write about it in the New York Times, and again, you're making this stuff up. Nobody's making you do this, and yet you must. And you always set yourself different tasks. You always want the next one to be not so much better, but you want it to come closer to that sort of vague idea of perfection that gets you started. The things that you intuit about the story that makes you intrigued enough to write the first sentence, but then it falls apart, the logic doesn't hold up, it goes in a direction you hadn't anticipated, and then you either have to follow behind or, it's, I have plenty of days, and I've got it written in my notebook many times. Why am I doing this? What?
I think all of your books answer that question. But let's talk about that beast known as editors. As they say, you can't live with them and you can't live without them. How do you get along with editors? Are they a necessary evil? Do they really make your work better, or is it somewhere in the middle?
I have been very fortunate. I've worked on my books. I've had the same editor since the first 100 pages of my first novel.
All the way through?
All the way through.
Wow.
And
who is that?
Jonathan Galassi, who is now the president of Frost Strauss, my publisher. Way back when I was in my late 20s, had gone from writing a few short stories and getting a few of them placed to taking the plunge and writing my first novel. One of the novelists that I had studied with in graduate school, a wonderful writer named Mark Smith, asked me, what I was doing since I left school, and I told him I was writing a novel, and he said, well, you need a literary agent. Now I'm going to send you to this woman who is not my agent, but she's my agent's partner, and I think she is the best literary agent in the world. She's Saul Bellows' agent, which took my breath away immediately. So he wrote a letter to Harriet Wasserman. Harriet called me and said, I have this wonderful letter from Mark Smith. Can you just bring down a few pages of what you're working on? My husband and I were living on the Upper East Side. She was in Midtown, and I was so intimidated. I couldn't even go to the post office I walked all the way down to 44th Street, where her office was, went up to her office and literally slipped it under the door of her office, and then ran away because I thought, this is Saul Bellows' agent, and she's going to be so embarrassed if she actually meets me and has to say, maybe you should go to law school. She read them and called me, and first thing she said was, I want to see everything you've got. I want to see what you published, what you haven't published, what other pages that you have of this novel. At the time, I had shown her 50, I had 50 more, and not even page 101. And she said, first she said, does it matter to you if you work with a male editor or a female editor? I was like, literate doesn't even have to be, it's not a requirement. I mean, editor and me, fine. And she said, and I said, no, of course it doesn't matter. And she said, well, there's a very young editor. He's just made senior editor at Houghton Mifflin. He's very bright. I think he would like your work, and I'll tell you what makes all the difference to me. He's an editor and not a writer. He will not try to influence or change what you're going to do. And you're so young, and you're just starting out. It would be very dangerous to be with somebody who wants to be a writer and is using you. And she was, I mean, at that time, if an editor had said, yes, kid, I want to publish your book, but you got to have a murder on page 101, I would have put a murder on page 101. And that has been the case all along. It's Jonathan waits mostly till I'm finished. Sometimes I send him pages just so I'm still working. But we never discuss it until I say, okay, I think this is the manuscript.
Yeah, it's a blessing.
Yes, yeah. Occasionally I have worked with magazine editors on short pieces, and I'm so spoiled that when a magazine editor will say, well, I think you can do without that, I'm just not used to it.
Welcome to my world.
Yes, exactly right.
I'm still looking for somebody with a big backyard where I can bury the body of my most recent editor. I didn't do it, but I still want a shovel and someplace to put the corpse. Okay, let's go all the way back. All the way back. The world is full of 10-year-old girls who write wonderful thank you notes to their grandmothers for birthday gifts. And the parents say, and the grandmother says, someday you really write great. You're going to write the great American novel. And this 10-year-old girl grows up and writes nothing but checks. You were that 10-year-old girl. Did you feel this in you when you were 10? Were you a writer when you were 10?
Yes, I was, but nobody told me I was going to write the great American novel. I always wrote. I mean, up until the time, as soon as I learned how to do it, I always wrote. I wrote stories. I wrote a novel, at about 11 or 12, handwritten, leaning on an album cover, But I think, it's a way, when you're a kid, it's a way for managing the world. Language was my way of doing it. Drawing was my daughter's way. And I think that for kids, it doesn't mean that it's a vocation or a career. It's just a way of getting a hold of things. I had two older brothers who both ended up lawyers, very opinionated. And I never got to say anything at the dinner table. I had lots of ideas too, but I was the stupid little sister, and I would get half a sentence out, and either they would say, hurry up, get to the point.
Little sister.
Right. So I could go off and I could write a story about a little sister, who buried her brothers in the backyard with great satisfaction. But there were no writers around. My parents were both big readers. They had great respect. My father, when you brought the report card, he would always say, the first thing I have to see is what grade you have in reading, because reading is the foundation for everything.
Okay.
It's that, that world.
Mm-hmm.
And it really wasn't until I got to college. I mean, I went to an all-girl Catholic school. Some of you may remember this. I don't know why, but it was an era when high school kids put on skits all the time, like little comedy sketches, for Teacher Appreciation Day. Oh, we need a skit. Sports night, we need a skit. And I was the skit writer. I was quiet, and I didn't play sports. I wasn't really, a great scholar. I didn't speak up much, but somehow I became the person who wrote all the funny skits. And it was about senior year, one of the nuns, who was very young, turned to me and said, "You know, you're good at this." And I think that was the first.
The C's part.
Well, not quite, because then the next thing she said was, "You could go to you could go out to LA and you could write for Carol Burnett." And by that time, I was like, I want to be Eugene O'Neill. I don't want to write for Carol Burnett. So it wasn't until I got to college, and then I had a teacher who was a journalist, a retired Air Force colonel, who said, "You're a writer." And that's when it all became clear. Of course I am.
Yeah. Let's talk about the third rail of American literature, young people. Today's young people trying to write fiction. Well, I'm going to let you finish that sentence, because I'm so old and cranky and so down on this kind of thing, and I've seen so many young people try to write, and it's like trying to crank your car when it's 20 below zero. You know, they go rah, 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 and they can't do it.
Yeah.
Is that your experience? Is that your view of young people coming into your world?
You know, I've been teaching for a long time now, so my views have changed a little bit. I'm still amazed and delighted that there are young people who want to write literary fiction, and even to be poets. They're out there. They understand you don't make a living as a poet. You often don't make a living writing literary fiction, or not aspiring to those airport walls. And yet they have, and this I recognize in them as a fellow feeling, they have that desire, yearning. They want to make sense of the world.
But can they? If their frame of reference is this, Alice, can they?
The thing that I have seen that's changing, that worries me, the thing that worries me, okay, first I'll say is worries me, that they're not the readers they used to be, even within the past decade. You know, if you want to write, I still believe you want to be a writer because you're a reader first. You've read something that has moved you, that has stayed with you, then you read something else that's even better, and then you start to open up and you see you can do this with fiction and you can do that with poetry, and that has been pretty much something, again, that I've recognized for a long time in every young writer that, or even just beginning writer that I've worked with. More and more, I don't see that. I don't see that voracious reading. Some of it, Harry Potter has done a lot of good things for the book industry, but when you have a generation of fiction writers whose only experience of being enthralled with a book is Harry Potter.
Well, what do you say to that? Yeah.
And you know, again, it's sort of not their fault. If she had just written one Harry Potter, they might have moved on. You know, when I was a kid, I read popular stuff, but then you look for something else. You have a great experience with a book, and then as soon as you finish it, you look, what else? Well, how can I find something that's going to give me another kind of experience? What this generation of young writers had, this kind of millennial generation, is they finished and they said, what else? And then they said, oh, here's another one. You know? And so that whole, and a lot of them read it from sort of middle school years through high school and college. So that time when you start reading subversive stuff, you know. I remember being a freshman in high school, and the bookmobile came to our high school, and the nun said, you can read anything, but don't get that Catcher in the Rye. And Catcher in the Rye sold out immediately. So all that excitement of discovering different voices and the stuff you maybe shouldn't be reading.
Yeah.
Moving from middle school YA is what they call it now, young adult fiction, into the world of adult fiction that maybe you don't even quite understand, but it's sort of exciting. You know, reading Faulkner for the first time when you're a college student or a high school student, you know, it knocks you out, it confuses you,
Yeah.
you know you're not getting it, but you want to. That experience is fading. Again, a lot of it has to do with what they've read, a lot of it has to do with how books are taught, you know? It's so much, oh, your parents are going through a divorce, then you should read this novel about a child just like you, whose parents are going through a divorce. When, no, you read Wuthering Heights and forget about your parents. You know,
Well said.
they look for themselves in literature rather than going beyond
Well,
themselves.
I think you've tabbed a very important point here. The book industry loves to say that Oprah Winfrey has made the business. I think she's unmade the business because she emotionalizes every book and every evaluation of every book. And it's exactly what you just said. Instead of thinking dispassionately and at a remove about whether this is literature and it's really portraying a situation or a character, the question is what it was in the third grade. Do you like it?
Right.
Do you not like it?
Right, yeah.
Come on, we're bigger people than that, aren't we? Aren't we? Aren't we?
You know, we hope. And
We hope.
the other thing, not to pound too much on Harry Potter, but I think there is that phenomenon that I'm dealing with, and the way English classes have to be entertaining and have you're not supposed to work with it. And then there are those reading guides that have ended up in the back of so many books. Some of them can be good and they can facilitate, say, discussion, but most of them are exactly like, how did you feel? They're not about the art of it. They're not about
The method of it.
the method.
How was this built?
Exactly. Structure, it seldom gets, you know, I mean, as I've said this to my students when I've railed against these things, because a lot of them, again, they like that. Oh no, that made me realize what I should be looking at. It's like, you know, in Moby Dick, Ishmael had a very difficult boss. Have you ever had the experience of having a difficult boss? And then you're away from the book is gone, you know? And it's like, you just had the experience of being Ishmael. Of course you've had a difficult boss. He was Ahab. Go back to the book and find out what it was like, but it's always that, okay, that's enough from the author. How did you know? Let's talk about you.
One last question before we go to your questions, ladies and gentlemen. It's about this. Tell us about your latest book, what you hope to do, and what you have done.
Oh, what I have done is still remains to be seen. As I was saying, you know, every book has a different genesis, and you do feel like a novice every time. Maybe this is the eternal youth of trying to write, you know, what you did with the last story, with the last novel. What anybody has said about you, all that falls away when you embark on the journey of telling a new story. You're telling a story for the first time. It's a story you've never told before. You're creating characters or creating lives that you've never found language for before, and now you have to find whole new language. So this book started out, oddly enough, with a conversation with a dear old friend who was a DC lawyer, but very interested in history, and it was after dinner over wine, and he mentioned that he had grown up in upstate New York, and he had a vague recollection of a guy who lived in some great aunt's house or great uncle's house, who the family took care of because he had served as a substitute in the Civil War for one of his relatives. And I sort of loved that, and it just sort of stayed with me. And I knew about substitutes, you know, that time during the war where you could hire somebody to go, hire a mercenary, so to speak, to go and fight, so that a lot of wealthier families, so that a favorite son could stay home and stay safe. It started out as being just sort of an agreement between people, rural people, a lot of immigrants would, and then it was kind of codified by the government. You had to pay this much money. Anyway, there was a novel that I read years and years ago, a historical novel by a friend of mine called Banished Children of Eve, which was about New York and the draft riots and the Civil War, and that had something about substitutes. I don't know why I was interested, but I don't write historical fiction, and that's not my way into a story. So the more I thought about it and read about it and thought about what would that mean for a family to have sort of this hovering responsibility for someone who had put himself in harm's way so that someone else could live, I started looking for the metaphor in it. What's the metaphorical interest in someone saying, I will go in harm's way, or asking someone, you go and put your life at risk. And the whole notion of gratitude, how long do you stay grateful to that person? If someone has put himself in harm's way, either killed or damaged, so that someone else can live and grow old and procreate, then that next generation is alive because of that person. And so is their progenitor. I mean, how many generations has to stay grateful to the person who made their lives possible? When does it just fade out? That was a long time ago. Can we stop talking about it? Even though in reality, we would not be here if it were not for that person. So, being born and raised and always trying to practice Catholic, right away the metaphor of he who died so that we may live sort of entered into the mix, and that sort of got me thinking about all kinds of notions about selflessness. Do we believe in selflessness in the 21st century? Do we appreciate it? Don't we think it's kind of delusional? Again, talking about my students, I often have wonderful conversations with graduating seniors or even grad students who come into my office and say, I think I'm going to go and teach for America, or I'm going to go into the Peace Corps or the Jesuit Volunteer Corps. I'm going to go live with poor people. I'm going to go live in Africa, and they'll have all these wonderful plans, and they will inevitably say, and it will look really good on my resume. And so I've often thought, what would they think of me and what would their parents think of me if I said to them, why don't you go do that for 2 years, but then never tell anyone?
By the way, that's the title of your next book.
Look good on my resume.
See, we've done something that'll grow here. Let me jump up and get the basket, and then we will let the audience ask the questions.
Let's see what the mystery questions
Okay.
are.
See who's on top here. Was Charming Billy someone you knew or a member of your family?
Neither, but a kind of amalgam of people in my family, people in friends' families, people I had heard about, but then also, again, in that effort that you make when you create a fictional character, to make that character unique, as we all are, someone who has never lived before. He is entirely himself as well. When my third novel was published at Weddings and Wakes, which John referred to. That was the first time I really used Irish Catholic New Yorkers as central to the story. And my poor long-suffering mother read the novel and she said to me, now I know this isn't our family, but how is anybody else going to? So Billy's sort of the same way. I know he's not a real person.
Okay, here's a real Charlie Rose question.
Oh my God.
What is on your book stand now? Hasn't he asked that question about 4,000 times? I'm sorry, but answer it, please.
Well, oddly enough, and I just finished it last night, and I have to say, probably finished it for it has to be 24 times at least that I've read this little novel. I just finished reading Turn of the Screw again.
Oh.
And it's good every time. It's amazing every time. That's another thing, I can't get my students to read Henry James. No way, no how. He is, poor Henry James. His one piece of wonderful advice about writing is that the only obligation of the writer is to be interesting. And when I give his books to young writers, the first thing they say is, I just wasn't interested in it.
You start with Daisy, because I'm under 30, I'm in 30s, and I love it.
See, good, okay, good,
So,
good.
You get them with Daisy.
Yeah.
We will.
Yeah, well, no, I tried, no,
Okay.
it's, the sentences are too long. That's what they tell me. The
Oh,
sentences are too long.
Okay, here's an Oprah question.
Uh-oh.
Yeah.
Crying.
What is the first book that made you cry?
Oh, probably, we had a ritual when I was growing up. My mother, being a city girl, although she lived in the suburbs, never learned how to drive. My father was the driver, and so we would have one night a week that he would drive us to the Elmont Public Library. And he would sit in the newspaper section, because that's what men did, and send my brothers off to, the war section. And I would always look for books about dogs. So I'm not sure which book about a dog made me cry first, but I always hoped that the books about dogs would make me cry. So I'm sure, it wasn't Marley and Me, it hadn't been published yet. But probably that kind of sentimental. I think as an adult and as a real reader, I think maybe not cheer up, cry, but taking your breath away and with an acknowledgement of what Cheever calls the pain and beauty of life, was reading Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse. That was transformative for me.
How do you select the names of your characters?
Well, they should have some import. I'm not Charles Dickens, it's not obvious, but I always feel like it's true of every choice you make as a fiction writer, because you are making this up. You're creating a new world out of nothing. So I always feel like I should have some sense, even if it's not perfectly clear, that this is the right, this is a name that this character should have. This feels right for the character. You don't want to, on the one hand, you don't want to load up names with meanings, because then it becomes manipulative. With this book, it was really easy because the Catholic Church really does have wonderful words. And so, especially naming nuns, having a somewhat dour nun who works in the convent laundry. And also their names that they choose for themselves, which makes it even more interesting. Most of us don't choose our names. So to have this sort of sour, dour, difficult woman nun has a PhD in laundry, working in the basement of this convent, and letting her have named herself Sister Illuminata. That's where a name that said, wow, this woman has depths. There's a lot going on underneath the surface, because she chose that name. That, as the writer, that tells me, oh, I really have to stop and think about her, because she's a lot more complex. But so there are those fun names. Sister Lucy is another one. Lucy, patron saint of eyes, who sees everything. She's short all business. She would never choose a name like Illuminata. She would be Lucy. So it's similar in any way, just something that adds to your understanding of the character.
What was the hardest scene you've ever written?
Oh gosh, they're all hard. Actually, it's the, the big scenes sometimes, I know this isn't true, but it's an expression we use, sometimes feel like they're writing themselves. They're not, and you've had to work and tear up and grieve to get there. But sometimes there's a certain point as the novel has developed, and you've laid down enough of the world, and there is a sense of inevitability. And so the scene unfolds somewhat inevitably. Often it's those middle scenes, the transitional scenes, the stuff that's important but not calling attention to itself, that are the hardest scenes to write.
What's the favorite character of yours that you've ever written? I know you love all your children.
Yeah, right. No, not really. Pauline, I don't know. Pauline wasn't supposed to be in the book that long, and she I couldn't get rid of her.
Wow. Tell her if you see her that we had a good shower the characters that I suppose, not so much that you love them, I see characters so much as a part of the construct of the novel. I'm not, and I know other writers see it differently. I'm not one of these writers who keeps thinking about, I wonder what they're doing now. After the book ended, I wonder, what they had for breakfast the next morning. I see them so intertwined with everything, the place and the language and the events and the details, that they only exist for me in the book itself, while they're on the pages of the book and while I'm working it out. But the characters that set the challenge for you I think are the ones that maybe because they're still intriguing. In this novel, there's a nun. She's young, very young when we first encounter her, and sort of the novel stays with her until she's an old nun. But I knew that she would be pure faith. I knew she needed to be a character who believed without question in all the promises of Christianity, which meant she also believed in eternal life without doubt. I think somewhere in the book I said, with the confidence of an eyewitness, is how she encountered her faith. No doubt, no questioning. And yet, I wanted it to be complex enough to be believable, and I didn't want to write down to her. She has a few superstitions, that seemed right for a woman of her education and her time and her background. But it was a real challenge for me to understand her. There are other characters whose faith I understand. I just have to describe it. But for me, the challenge was how to understand the completeness of her faith when I don't share it. Final question. Did you ever consider writing under a pseudonym?
You mean one of those best-selling books? Right. Writing a bad best-selling novel, I'm sure, is not as easy as it looks. No, I have to say, no, not yet, but it might happen.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here tonight.